The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, yesterday we had the second Republican primary debate. It was the CNN debate, follow up August 6th, Fox News Facebook debate. This was a very, very different debate than the first one. And interestingly, it was different in terms of not only how the candidates acted in the debate, but also as far as how the network treated it. Fox News taking a sort of approach where it was just very transparent that they were, number one, just trying to get candidates to argue with each other, and then number two, taking a very anti-Trump point of view. And while CNN clearly was trying to sort of stir the pot and get people to respond to criticisms from other candidates, they did actually make an attempt to get into some political ideas and press candidates on, would you be for this or would you be against it? The big criticism I had was some absurd questions, like what would you like your Secret Service code name to be if you were president? Just a completely ridiculous question. And also just way too long, Lewis. I mean, a 3-hour debate.
It was way too long, but I'm going to disagree with you. I think I liked that question. I think it's important to have some insight into the actual character of these people and try to get some type of reaction out of them that might not be the reaction of a normal politician. And
I think that's fine, but if you're going to go 3 hours and throw in those questions, maybe you could do 2.5 and fit in some questions that sort of bring out the character of the candidates without having to extend it the extra half hour. You know what I'm saying?
I agree. And, I would have liked to see more questions, maybe not questions like this one, maybe other personal questions as simple as what do you do in your free time? Although I guess if you ask that, we could expect to hear some red meat.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I can't even imagine what Mike Huckabee would say. I mean, I guess he
said he
his
reads
time
the Bible.
Reading the Bible. That's exactly what came to mind. Yeah. Some really bizarre exchanges. One about the Spanish language. Donald Trump criticized Jeb Bush for speaking Spanish. Jeb Bush said that speaking Spanish is okay. And then Marco Rubio, who has Cuban roots, decided he didn't want to miss an opportunity to jump in. And he interjected with, well, my grandfather spoke Spanish and he was conservative. So there's not necessarily anything liberal about speaking Spanish. And then one of the most laughably ridiculous moments was when Donald Trump said, hey, I would build a wall on the Mexican border in order to curb undocumented immigration. And then Ben Carson said, Donald Trump's idea of building a wall will not work. I would build a double wall with a road in between, and that's the plan that would work. I mean, just a almost cartoonish exchange.
It was very silly as the wall itself. But we were expecting to hear a bit about the wall, so we did.
A lot of attacks. Interestingly, Carly Fiorina only attacking Hillary Clinton. Carly Fiorina given the opportunity, and we'll get to this later, to fight back against Donald Trump's comments about, can you imagine someone with Carly Fiorina's face as president? And she opted to take the high road, instead choosing to attack Hillary Clinton. And as I watched, Lewis, we talked a while back about that $500,000 donation from a Ted Cruz super PAC to a Carly Fiorina super PAC. And we hypothesized, well, Ted Cruz and others may have an interest in keeping Carly Fiorina there because as a woman, she can criticize Hillary Clinton in a way that maybe some of the male Republican candidates cannot. And at almost every turn, Carly Fiorina turning whatever question it was into an attack on Hillary.
Yeah, which is really unnecessary. I don't see the point in attacking Hillary or Obama in a Republican primary campaign. Presumably everyone watching is going to agree with you anyway. It just seems unnecessary.
Totally unnecessary. And let's discuss some of the actual policy ideas that came out of the debate. Scott Walker wants to balance the budget and cut taxes, and he wants to avoid bankruptcy. He also says he would repeal Obamacare on day one. Really nothing notable whatsoever from Scott Walker. Chris Christie had essentially no ideas, just touting his record, and there was sort of a discussion about whether his record is good or not or whose record matters. But Chris Christie's lone idea that I saw was that he has been vetoing tax increases in New Jersey, and he would keep vetoing tax increases if he were to be president. Donald Trump actually gave some ideas, which was fantastic because we hadn't really heard much of anything from Donald Trump. He said he wants to let ISIS fight Syria. He says we should do something about North Korea and their nukes. As I mentioned, he wants to build a wall on the Mexican border. He wants to kick out all 11 or 12 million undocumented immigrants, which is, of course, going to be completely impossible, outrageously expensive. And interestingly, he wants to cut taxes on the middle class and raise them on the top income earners, as he would on his friends, as he said, the hedge fund managers. He also went the Herman Cain route, Lewis. When he was pressed for some specifics, he said, hey, I'm going to hire the best people to advise me on this stuff, which was a similar tactic as that which Herman Cain used in 2012.
Yeah, but and he wasn't afraid to say it. He said it pretty bluntly, but he really didn't have a choice. And it's not really the worst answer in the world.
No.
But at this point, you've been campaigning for how long? I mean, you should be able to come up with something else.
Well, he kept saying a lot of his specific plans will be coming out in the next 2 weeks, so I guess we'll keep an eye out for those. Ben Carson did have one reasonable idea, which is let's index the minimum wage to some economic indicator so we can stop debating the minimum wage every couple of years. I absolutely think that that's something worth looking into. Ted Cruz, his big idea was ripping up the Iran nuclear deal on his first day in office. Jeb Bush wants to appoint justices to the Supreme Court who would uphold the Constitution. Wow, Jeb, you're doing a great job of not being completely milquetoast and boring. Appoint justices that would uphold the Constitution. Carly Fiorina, Lewis, who I think did quite well, she had specific ideas. Most of the ideas basically were alluding to restarting the Cold War. That's okay. They were still ideas. Rebuilding the Sixth Fleet, rebuilding missile defense in Poland, military exercises in the Baltic states, and sending even more troops to Germany to scare Russia. Carly Fiorina, she's the Cold War candidate.
And she seemed very cold. To me, she just seemed kind of like a machine up there. I'm not kidding. She was sharp, but she was probably the most calculated of everyone up there, and she just seemed like a machine. Although,
interesting
yes,
you say that she was like a machine, because I received a bunch of tweets from people saying that she seemed robotic.
Yeah, she really did. But she did have specifics, and I applaud her for that.
John Kasich and Rand Paul were quite reasonable. John Kasich saying, hey, hold on a second. Let's not rip up the Iran nuclear agreement. Let's see if they violate it. Because if we want to do military action, if they violate the agreement, we now have a great pretext under which to use military action. I completely agree there. He did go off the rails when he suggested defunding Planned Parenthood. I mean, just utterly insane. Rand Paul said, let's wait and see if Iran complies with the agreement. Let's keep talking to Iran. Let's keep talking to Russia. Let's keep talking to China. Very reasonable. And Rand Paul also pointing out that we have this terrible habit in the U.S. of toppling secular dictators and then bringing in an increase in radical Islam in many of those places, and that's something we should be careful of. So Rand Paul, he has a lot of crazy ideas. He got good topics in this debate that, at least with me, sounded somewhat reasonable.
Yeah, he nailed it several times during the debate, but then he'd say something that is completely absurd, like his flat tax. But yeah, that's why I think Rand Paul is one of the more reasonable candidates. But so we're not going to agree with one of these politicians on everything.
Certainly not. I think the people that did the best were Chris Christie, I think, did pretty well. I think Rand Paul did do well, but I think my sensibilities may be different compared to the sort of average Republican voter at this point. John Kasich, aside from the insane Planned Parenthood comment, came off as pretty reasonable. And Carly Fiorina, aside from her robotic delivery, she dealt with Donald Trump well, and I think she also was a factor. She was a presence, and I think she did quite well. We will wait and see what the polls show us and how the polls change. The next Republican debate is Wednesday, October 28th in Boulder, Colorado. A lot can happen in 5 weeks. Let's talk a couple specific moments from the second Republican debate. There was this moment where Carly Fiorina was asked to comment about Donald Trump saying that her face was not the face of someone who should be president, and I think she responded in a very classy way. Here's Carly Fiorina. Here's that entire exchange.
Ms. Fiorina, I do want to ask you about this. In an interview last week in Rolling Stone magazine, Donald Trump said the following about you, quote, "Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that? Can you imagine that, the face of our next president?" Mr. Trump later said he was talking about your persona, not your appearance. Please feel free to respond what you think about his persona.
You know, it's interesting to me. Mr. Trump said that he heard Mr. Bush very clearly and what Mr. Bush said. I think women all over this country heard very clearly what Mr. Trump said.
Yeah, Donald Trump played nice, and he said she's got a beautiful face and she's a beautiful woman. And then sticking with comments about people's appearance, here's Donald Trump criticizing Rand Paul's physical appearance.
Mr. Senator Paul, your name has been invoked.
I kind of have to laugh when I think, sounds like a non sequitur. He was asked whether or not he would be capable and it would be in good hands to be in charge of the nuclear weapons, and all of a sudden there's a sideways attack at me. I think that really goes to the judgment. Do we want someone with that kind of character, that kind of careless language to be negotiating with Putin? Do we want someone like that to be negotiating with Iran? I think really there's a sophomoric quality that is entertaining about Mr. Trump. But I am worried. I'm very concerned about having him in charge of the nuclear weapons, because I think his response, his visceral response to attack people on their appearance, short, tall, fat, ugly, my goodness, that happened in junior high. Are we not way above that? And would we not all be worried to have someone like that in charge of the nuclear arsenal?
Mr. Trump.
I never attacked him on his look, and believe me, there's plenty of subject matter right there. That I can tell you.
But Jake,
Why doesn't anybody ask why anybody's appearance even matters? That's the obvious question to me. Jake Tapper sets up Carly Fiorina to just respond to Donald Trump's comment about his looks, and then Donald Trump and Rand Paul talk about whose looks they're commenting on. What about anybody saying, hey, wait a second, why should anyone's looks matter?
Well, do they matter? No, they don't. But we do have plenty of evidence that shows that subconsciously it does matter to the average voter.
Sure, but that doesn't mean that we need to have a discussion about who's attractive and who isn't.
It's not substantive. I know that, and But this is Donald Trump, the entertainer. He's entertaining while he's debating. You know what? It seems to work for him.
Another interesting and totally absurd moment from the second debate among the Republican primary candidates on CNN was when, as Lewis says, professional entertainer Donald Trump started touting insane vaccine myths, including a connection between vaccines and autism that's been massively discredited. There is no doubt about it at this point. Here is Donald Trump telling this anecdotal story of a kid, Lewis, who got a vaccine and then became autistic weeks later. Let's take a listen to that.
Autism has become an epidemic. 25 years ago, 35 years ago, you look at the statistics, not even close. It has gotten totally out of control. I am totally in favor of vaccines, but I want smaller doses over a longer period of time. Because you take a baby in, and I've seen it, and I had my children taken care of over a long period of time, over a 2 or 3 year period of time, same exact amount. But you take this little beautiful baby and you pump, it looks just like it's meant for a horse, not for a child. And we've had so many instances, people that work for me just the other day, 2 years old, 2.5 years old, a beautiful child, went to have the vaccine and came back and a week later got a tremendous fever, got very, very sick, now is autistic.
I don't even know, Lewis, what to say about this, but Trump going fully in that direction of anecdotal stories about vaccines causing autism. And Dr. Ben Carson was asked to weigh in on it, and he said, well, we don't have any evidence that there's any link between autism and vaccinations whatsoever. This is like super, super, super fringe. And you would hope any presidential candidate, Lewis, would know that we don't base science on anecdotes or Trump's understanding of the timeline of a child's vaccination schedule and autism diagnosis that he probably heard second or third hand himself. This is not, I hope, how any presidential candidate would make decisions about anything were they to be elected.
Right, and at least he didn't flat out say that children should not be getting vaccines, and that these absolutely, he suggested that it could cause autism, and so he wasn't. Although we would consider this an extreme point of view, it does get a lot worse. So at least he didn't completely just throw vaccines out the window.
Well, I think that on a scale of 1 being a totally science-based approach to vaccines and 10 being a completely insane, non-science, anti-vaxxer approach to vaccines, Donald Trump's position was probably around a 7, right? Which is anecdotally, I've seen autism be caused by vaccines, but I still vaccinated my kids.
Yeah, I was going to say a 7 as well. So I guess we're in agreement.
We'll take a break. A lot more coming up today. Glad you're with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We are funded as a program by members. This includes people who listen to our podcasts, people who watch our YouTube clips or watch the show on the Free Speech TV broadcast or TV or radio, etc. You can sign up for membership at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's new member of the day is Brandon Roybal. Brandon, thank you for supporting our show. Join Brandon at davidpakman.com/membership. Several weeks in a row, I've had documentary recommendations. It's been a little while since I recommended a book, and I have a book to recommend to you today. It is by Philip Roth, the great Philip Roth. It is called The Plot Against America, and it's a sort of alternative history in which FDR loses the 1940 presidential election to Charles Lindbergh, a known Nazi sympathizer and pioneering airline pilot. And the novel follows the situation for Philip Roth's sort of imaginary family, his fictionalized family in New Jersey in the 1940s. And this is, I in the past recommended Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, which is also a sort of alternative World War II history, which is fantastic. It's being turned into a show, a series by Amazon, and you can already watch the pilot episode. And Lewis, it is fantastic. The pilot episode is available for free on Amazon. And being a fan of The Man in the High Castle, I was very interested to read a sort of different take on an alternative resolution during World War II. Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, and just absolutely fantastic.
It sounds pretty good, Dave. I recommend your recommendation. I like that alternate history stuff.
Check out all of my recommendations at davidpakman.com/recommendations. Again, the book is The Plot Against America by Philip Roth, but also, I'll just remind you, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, and you can also go on Amazon.com, and for free, you can watch the pilot episode of the upcoming series, The Man in the High Castle, and it is very, very good. Hey, Ann Coulter is being really criticized by a bunch of civil rights groups, including the Anti-Defamation League, for her comment about yesterday's CNN Republican debate regarding the candidates mentioning Israel. Now, I noticed that many of the candidates, Ted Cruz and Mike Huckabee and others, were talking about Israel in a way that really struck me as pandering. And I'll get into the specifics of that in a second. And Ann Coulter realized the same thing, tweeting, "How many effing Jews do these people think there are in the United States? Maybe it's to suck up to the evangelicals." Now, the Anti-Defamation League put out a statement saying that these comments were ugly, spiteful, and borderline anti-Semitic. They said that Coulter is pandering to the basest of her base, adding that her messages challenging the candidate's support for Israel were offensive, ugly, spiteful, and borderline anti-Semitic, and that they give fodder to those who buy into the anti-Semitic notions that Jews, quote, control the U.S. government or wield disproportionate power in politics. I 100% agree that Ann Coulter's comments had anti-Semitic undertones and that they were sort of a who cares about Jews type of thing and utterly despicable. But I completely agree that this was total pandering amongst these right-wing candidates. It's true. There are very few Jews in the United States, 0.19% of the world population, 1.7% of the US population. And most of those Jews, Lewis, are not going to vote for any of the Republican presidential candidates because Jews are very liberal in the United States and they mostly vote for Democrats. So this was absolute pandering by the Republican candidates to evangelical Christians who support Israel for insane, non-evidence-based reasons about messiahs and the second coming of Christ. And as a supporter of Israel who supports Israeli companies and blah, 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 I don't want Republicans pandering on the topic of Israel. American Jews are perfectly happy supporting liberal values that they believe are best represented by typically the Democratic candidates here. And I don't want evangelical Christians involved with Israel whatsoever.
Yeah, it's pandering all over the place, but you knew we were going to hear some of this because having a strong alliance with Israel and backing Israel is a right-wing talking point. And so we were expecting it, yes. And I don't think that it's really pandering to Jews. I think it's just throwing out some Republican red meat.
I agree. And if it's pandering to Jews, it's pointless. And I think the Republicans are smart enough to know they're not going to get the support of the American Jewish community. I was in Israel a couple of months ago, and I, at cafes, would sometimes find myself sitting next to some of it, particularly not so much in Tel Aviv, which is like basically the Israeli version of Brooklyn. You couldn't find a more secular place, but more in Jerusalem, I would find myself sitting next to very clear American evangelical Christians who are there because they're trying to bring on the second coming of Christ and all of this nonsense. And it was utter insanity. And I say, as someone who is a supporter of Israel, I have no interest whatsoever in these evangelical Christians getting involved with Israel, period. A hospital has refused to tie a woman's tubes over religious convictions. WWMT is reporting that a pregnant woman is speaking out after a Catholic hospital refused to tie her tubes because of their religious convictions. She has a brain tumor and she's pregnant, and she has been advised not to have any more children. So the idea is she is going to be, as a result of the brain tumor, she's going to be giving birth completely under anesthesia. And what she wants to do, rather than have a second procedure to have her tubes tied, she wants to just have her tubes tied when she delivers the baby under anesthesia. Perfectly logical, Lewis. Why have two major procedures if you can just have one? But the hospital is denying the procedure based on religious beliefs. Jessica Mann, 33 years old, has enlisted the help of the ACLU. And if you look at the comments that people are making on articles about this situation online, you'll see people saying, hey, she should just go to a different hospital. And some pointing to the federal law, which does provide an exemption for medical providers who don't want to do abortion or sterilization services. But officials with the ACLU say federal protections cited as far as these exemptions for religion do not apply in this particular case. They say that the guidelines not only substitute religious doctrine for best medical practices, but disproportionately harm women because of the focus on reproductive issues. So how are we to interpret this? Here's how we interpret it. This is not a valid argument. It is often sort of accepted as more valid when it relates to women's health issues, reproductive health issues, pregnancies, etc. But imagine that a Christian Scientist hospital that doesn't believe in antibiotics sent every single person who went in with something as simple as a sinus infection or who had been bitten by a tick to go to a different hospital because they don't believe in antibiotics. The outrage would be huge. But for whatever reason, Lewis, it's sort of more acceptable when it comes to women's health and women's reproductive issues to say, hey, religious exemptions are completely valid here above state law, above federal law, whereas if it were about antibiotics, it would be seen as ludicrous.
Yeah, and it may sound confusing. Why is tubes being tied? How is that an interference with their religious beliefs? It's not an abortion. It's not, but these are the same people who don't want contraceptives around.
Right. It's a form of sterilization, kind of, in that it prevents the sort of natural process of fertilization of a woman's eggs from happening.
And so if some woman were to walk in here with ovarian cancer,
absolutely.
Well, yeah, what would happen then?
That's the exact right question to be asking, which is how far does this slippery slope go? We are against, Lewis, using slippery slope arguments when they really don't make sense. But this is one of those cases where when you start blurring these lines, how far does it go? The question should be, does the science-based, non-religiously dogmatic medical community believe that this is the appropriate procedure? And if so, let's do that procedure. This is not good for humanity. This is not good for society. Nations with universal health care, by the way, have much less of what amounts to basically religious dogma over medical necessity. And that may be yet another one of the positive side effects of a single payer system.
Yeah, I feel like we're living in the dark ages here. It's really embarrassing, but hey, onwards and upwards. You can't go downhill from here.
Join us on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show. Lewis is on our Facebook page. I'm there too. We'll talk to you after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Lawrence Mishel, president of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Very interesting recent paper from EPI, Productivity and a Typical Worker's Pay, Why It Matters and Why It's Real. Larry, this is such an interesting topic. And, when we talk about wages, there's often a number of indicators used as sort of benchmarks that we can compare wages to. A common one when talking about the minimum wage is inflation. Sometimes, though, we hear about how the minimum wage has shifted in correlation to, or sometimes not, productivity. And you've pointed out that with regard to wage inequality, productivity is actually a very important factor to look at. Let's start there. Why is it such an important indicator?
Well, let's start with the basic facts as you laid them out, which is that compensation for a typical worker has been stagnant for most of the last 40 years, since 1973 or 1979. And when I'm saying that, I'm reflecting both all the wages and all the benefits that people get. And when I say typical worker, I mean one of two measures we've used, one that encompasses the wages of basically the bottom 80% of the workforce, and another which is the median worker, which is the worker right in the middle of the pack, someone who makes more than half the workforce and less than half the workforce. So those measures of compensation grew a total of 9% over that period of time, which is about 0.2% a year. That's why we call it stagnant. And the only period of really robust growth of wages and benefits was in the late 1990s. So as you point out, we do compare this to productivity. And what is that? Productivity is the output of goods and services per hour worked. It's really what each worker is creating per hour that they work. And that is the basis of the way we grow the economic pie. So the point that we make in the paper is that this productivity, technically net of depreciation of all the capital, grew about 72% since 1973, but the hourly compensation of a typical worker grew about 9%. And what does that mean? That means that there was a lot of income, wealth, and wages produced by the economy. It just didn't get to most people. And that's really important to understand because many people feel like we have a bad economy and that's why things haven't gone so well. Well, the fact is it wasn't because the economy didn't produce enough. It's because the economy has been restructured in a way that most people just don't get much of the benefit of the productivity that they themselves produced. And why is that? And that gets to your point. It's primarily inequality.
Right. And I want to get to, if we can take it in a sort of a few steps, I would love to get to how this understanding should impact how we read employment numbers that we get every month. But let me hold off on that for a second. So if we had a situation, Larry, where we saw this same very, sub 1% per year wage growth, but we also saw a lack of productivity growth, we could actually say, listen, the problem is being caused by the fact that we're just not producing that much. It is a broader economic downturn, and as such, wage growth is stagnant as well. But what you're saying is very different, which is that wages have not been going up very much. Productivity has, and the sort of excess productivity above the wage increase has been going up towards the richest, the big corporations and the richest within those corporations.
That's essentially it. That you can complain at various times that we have productivity which should be better, and we're not saying that economic policy shouldn't focus on how to raise productivity, but we are pointing out that the productivity we have, we think you would expect it to be associated with much broader increase in living standards for the vast majority and wages, and the beneficiaries of the productivity are those who receive income from wealth, capital income, basically profits, dividends, etc., and the very highest earners, those in the top 1%, top 5%, top 10% of wage earners. And so the vast majority has not seen the growth.
So in the last several years, while President Obama has been president, we've seen some recurring talking points from those who wish to criticize President Obama in terms of the jobs created. And a couple of the popular ones are, number one, whatever number of jobs are being created, wages are not going up, and that is President Obama's fault, and it's an indicator of a bad economy. The other popular one is, well, jobs are being created, but they're bad jobs as measured by the salaries that these jobs pay. Now, we've already debunked the later one. In reality, the proportion of low, middle, and high income jobs created during the Obama presidency basically mirrors those same proportions that we've seen over the last several decades. I want to go to the first one, though. When we hear that jobs are being created, but wages are not increasing, and thus that is a sign of a bad economy, is it not completely ignoring that those jobs are creating significant additional wealth? It's just that the workers creating the wealth aren't the recipients of said wealth.
Well, I think we have to, I think those are some good points. I think we should acknowledge that the period since 2007, which predates President Obama, have been one of a really substantial recession, which has really done great damage to jobs and incomes. But I think the frame that says something to do with President Obama is a little bit bizarre because, of course, he wasn't present or any way responsible for the Great Recession. I think it's also important to note that wages have been stagnant for college graduates and high school graduates, blue-collar workers and white-collar workers for a long time, at least since 2002. So the last recovery, the business cycle that went from 2000 to 2007, which was based on George Bush's watch, in that recovery, wages didn't grow at all relative to inflation. So this is something that really predates President Obama. It's something that was present under President Reagan from 1979 to 1995. And so this is a long-standing problem. And I don't think it's a critique of President Obama's policies, but it is a critique of the kind of economy that we have now. And I think what's interesting at this moment of time is that you find both Democrats and Republicans talking about wage stagnation. And I think we should have a robust conversation in this country about what we can do to actually get wages to rise robustly for everybody. I think some ideas are good and some are not. The main point of this paper, one of the main takeaways about showing the divergence between productivity and the growth of wages and benefits for the typical worker, is that you can't say like frankly what Jeb Bush did last night. Let's have 4% growth. Now I don't think his policies are going to get us to 4% growth, but the fact is, excuse me, if you get growth, which just basically means creating jobs and productivity, does not mean you're actually going to raise wages. That there has to be policies which reconnect the growth of wages for the vast majority, and growth of productivity and growth more generally. And that's the major takeaway. Don't you know, better growth is good, more jobs is good, but we have to actually reconnect wages to growth. How do you do that? Well, a much higher minimum wage, restoring collective bargaining, doing things like what President Obama is doing in revising overtime so many more people are eligible for overtime pay, making undocumented workers eligible for citizenship so that they are not exploited, so that they earn more money.
All right. I think we may have lost Lawrence Mishel. We were about to wrap up. The paper is Productivity and a Typical Worker's Pay, the Economic Policy Institute. We were speaking with economist Lawrence Mishel. Thanks to him for joining us. He did lose his connection just as we were about to wrap up. Fortunately, it didn't happen after the first 3 minutes. We will take a break and be back with plenty more after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
A new human ancestor was discovered at a University of Arkansas lab where a biological anthropologist who's part of a big team of scientists, they were able to verify that fossils found in a South African cave belong to a new species of human ancestor. They announced this new species, Homo naledi, on Thursday, September 10th. And over the last 2 years, Lucas Delazine, assistant professor of anthropology in the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences, compared known hominid teeth to these newly discovered fossils to see if this is actually a new scientific discovery. And they said that indeed it is. They say we are all in agreement that the fossils are different than anything found previously. These were found near Johannesburg at a cave known as Rising Star in the Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site. They found actually a ton of fossils. And interestingly, aside from the novelty of Homo naledi, this seemed to be a sort of ritual burial site, which was not previously seen in early hominids, Lewis. So a bunch of interesting finds as a result of this.
Yeah, we always love hearing about finds like this. It seems that every few years or so, maybe longer than that, we have some type of discovery like this. And Dave, the religious folks are losing their minds.
Yeah, well, because every time we see a discovery like this, it can't be ignored that obviously this stuff is way older than the 6,000 to 12,000 years old that young Earth creationists believe the world to be. There are, however, lots of questions. Like, for example, how old are the fossils? Where does this Homo naledi fit in the broader scheme of human evolution? And also, I'm interested in this burial site thing. How did these remains arrive so deep within the cave system? Was it that they were buried by erosion? Is it that they were actually deposited there as a sort of primitive cemetery or burial ground? A lot of interesting stuff there. And then also a lot of questions about Homo naledi. Small brain size, curved fingers, trunk and hip joints that resemble pre-human Australopithecines, but at the same time, the wrists and hands and legs and feet look like the more modern Neanderthals and modern humans. So every time this happens, Lewis, we get questions of, is this an ancestor? Is this a cousin to modern humans? How much like modern humans did Homo naledi look? And I find it to be all completely fascinating. And I actually am just now starting to dig into a new book called, it's not super new, it's relatively new, called Sapiens by Yuval Harari. And it is all about the history of humans. And I find the topic very, very interesting.
It is an interesting topic. Yes, I have not done much reading on the matter, although I have watched many documentaries and TV shows about it. And of course, visited museums where I've seen some incredible stuff.
There's a new study that's been released by the California-based Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and it talks about the plight of families that have family members in prison. And the study looked at more than 300 family members impacted by incarceration, and it shows that the economic impact on the family members that are not in prison is huge as a result of having a family member go to prison. And it talks about court fees, visitation expenses, because often inmates are housed not very close to where their families live, the cost of providing basic necessities for themselves, and of every once in a while bringing things to the inmates, that there is a huge decline in economic well-being for the families of those who are incarcerated. And who suffers the most? This is fascinating. A men's issue. Incarceration is often thought of as a men's issue because so many more men are incarcerated than are women, and that's absolutely true. But in terms of who suffers the most economically outside of prison as a result of incarceration, it is women. Women make up 83% of family members outside of prison. This is a direct result of the overwhelming number of inmates being men. And they are the most negatively affected financially as a result of the incarceration status quo that we have in this country. 2/3 of those outside of prison had difficulty meeting basic needs. 70% of those families were caring for children under the age of 18. 2/3 of the families interviewed said that they were being relied on by recently released inmates to find housing. We've talked about price gouging on phone calls out of prison. There are so many issues here, and it's a common response from detractors who don't want to admit we have a serious problem with incarceration in this country. They say, hey, if you didn't break the law, you wouldn't be in prison in the first place. And the reality, Lewis, is so much more complex than that.
Yeah, it's. I don't think people in the criminal justice system are really considering the repercussions on the family and on society as a whole when they're just throwing people away for these drug offenses and things like that. It is really quite disruptive and expensive. I mean, think about how much money is going to help families and relatives of people who are incarcerated because they were thrown in prison.
Right. When we talk about the financial impact, we have to talk not only of the cost of incarceration, we have to talk not only of the cost of prosecuting this failed drug war, but we have to talk about the reality that we may well be putting more of those family members that are out of prison on welfare benefits and other types of social assistance as a result of eliminating the income and income generating capacity of he or she who is incarcerated. And then when you add to this the fact that we have disproportionate imprisonment of minorities relative to whites for the same crimes, it reinforces poverty in minority communities. Society ends up paying one way or another. And for the people who just like our authoritarian incarceration system, there's no way to talk sense into them, no matter what facts you present.
No. And then we have all the problems that people face when they are out of prison. And life certainly does not get easier.
Let's go to your voicemails. 219-2DavidP is our voicemail number you can call any time of day. Yesterday, we talked about whether ISIS could be defeated peacefully. Here's one caller who doesn't think they could be.
David, this is Chris calling from Vermont. Stopping ISIS. The question was, can they be stopped peacefully? The answer, I'm afraid, is no. Like Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, he had to take the gun to the rabid dog in the street and shoot it down to protect his children and the rest of the people in the neighborhood. ISIS are rabid dogs. They're rabid dogs foaming at the mouth, and anything short of just executing them is not going to work.
Wow. So a very, very aggressive point of view. We need to execute the rabid dogs of ISIS. Certainly not equivocating on that one. Send me your thoughts, 219-2DavidP. We have a fantastic bonus show coming up for you today. Sign up for membership and get instant access to the bonus show and the entire commercial-free video and audio show, and of course the archive of programming dating all the way back to 2005. You know where to do it, davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.